Hi, my name is Terje Toomistu. I'm an anthropologist working in the University of Tartu, and I am also a documentary filmmaker. And in my today's talk, I am talking about the striving for elsewhere, Estonian youth in mobility from the Soviet-era hippies to contemporary nomads. But before I begin, let me share a story that was recounted to me by an Estonian writer called Juhan Haavicht. And the story comes from early 1970s, at the time when he was a university student. The first year of university, we had this guy on our course who had been hitchhiking around the Soviet Union already during high school. And in November, around October celebrations, he disappeared with some friend. At first, we tried to cover him, a fact that he didn't attend lectures, but later we didn't bother signing X's for him all the time, X's to indicate the attendance. From time to time, we'd get postcards. Who said it was warm in Samarkand? It's freaking cold and you can't find any empty bottles. And from other such places. We had almost forgotten about him. We had only gone to the university together for 2 months. But in January, when classes started again, our course was assembled before the Central Committee of the University Komsomol. Comrades, you have done a bad job at educating your companion. Your friend Peter attempted to cross the Turkish border from Armenia. He later said that he just wanted to peek over the mountains to see what it was like. So the starting point of my talk today is this sensation that I'm sure many of you find familiar. It's this ascension to striving for elsewhere, the desire to peek behind the mountains, to see beyond the horizon. And however, in this talk, I'm not that much interested in that sentiment per se, but how this sentiment relates to socio-political contexts, how it may forge identities, subjectivities, as well as subcultures, but also the other way around, how identities, subjectivities, and subcultures feed that desire for elsewhere. In other words, how one may adjust their lifestyle, their means of income, in a way that it would enable them to see the world. And then again, how certain self-identities seek and perhaps even need validation specifically through traveling. But probably also the starting point for that talk today is my own personal experience as someone who was born in the Soviet Union, but then raised in the post-socialist Estonia, and who spent around half of their 20s traveling, living, studying, researching, filmmaking in quite a few countries. Because that was something that my parents were not able to do. I draw in this talk from my long-term research with the hippie movement in Soviet Union that was part of a wider transmedia project that also included a documentary film, but also a traveling exhibition. And as we know, the Soviet Union, in Soviet Union, traveling was a privilege of the very few. In the second part of the lecture, I draw on my current ongoing postdoctoral research about young Estonians abroad. I'm interested in the latest wave of emigration as well as nomadic patterns among young Estonians. But let's begin with the Soviet hippie movement. The hippie movement in the West, with highlights such as Summer of Love in San Francisco in 1967 and Woodstock Festival in 1969, and all that had a profound impact on the youth on the other side of the Iron Curtain. It triggered a movement which influenced several generations and turned into a distinct subculture in its own right. And that subculture lasted basically until the collapse of the Soviet Union in early 90s. By late 1960s, the presence of the hippie movement was very much here. Radio Luxembourg and other foreign radio channels leaked through the Iron Curtain and inspired the youth. Hippie-era records were smuggled in and they were available in the underground markets, as well as sent by generous relatives from abroad, to kids. And then they were re-recorded to reel-to-reel tapes and exchanged endlessly among networks of music lovers and friends. In 1967, Estonian television reported that in Tallinn alone, around 8 public phone booths were destroyed daily. The kids smashed the phones in order to steal the electromagnetic coils from the phone receivers and use them as pickup devices to turn their acoustic guitars into electric ones. And that case well illustrates the fanaticism among youth. That same year, the Soviet record label Melodia released the first song of the Beatles in USSR. That song was called Girl. And that was followed by an unprecedented emergence of locally formed beat bands. An example of such is Lüürikud. Strangely, also several articles were published in the media of Soviet Estonia at the end of 1960s. Describing the demise of the Western youth due to the influence of a horrible new drug. LSD, a door to insanity or paradise, was the headline of a newspaper of Edasi in 1968. Although these articles were criticizing the failure of the capitalist society, it obviously made adventurous young people here raise their eyebrows. The first people who linked their subjectivities and activities with the Western hippies in Soviet Estonia emerged around 1966 and 67. But the movement involved several generations, lasting until the collapse of the Soviet Union. But if you'd ask, how did they become one? How did they become a hippie? They would simply reply through music. But that music not only created a sense of union with the Western protesting youth, but it also stimulated certain affective state of mind, created a sense of a promise for elsewhere. And now I'm going to show you, to demonstrate that idea, a clip from the Soviet hippies documentary.
Loomulikult tundus see absurd, et muusika põrandaalune oli. Minust paar aastat vanem onupoeg oli üks Eesti esimesi bänditegijaid ja tema kaudu ma nagu sain ka teada, et on olemas Beatlid ja et neid annab kui niimoodi raadiot osavalt kruttida, siit-sealt kuulata ja ühtlasi siis seoses muusikaga jäi ka kõrvu palju muud, mis mujal maailmas nagu toimub.
Ütleme, punkt 1, ega inglise keelt keegi ei rääkinud. Ja kujuta ette seda mõju, ütleme, sa ei tunne seda keelt, sa ei tea, millest üldse lauldakse, millest üldse, aga see muusika iseenesest, ta oli juba sellise lainel, sellise vibration, such a strange vibration, eks, ja see pani siin, ma siiamaani, ma ei tea pooltest tugudest, millest üldse jutt käib.
Драйв как раз и вышел на такой уровень, что он вот происходило вот это вот колыхание сознания общего.
В 1965 году я уже стал другим человеком, понимаешь? У меня стала другая прическа, другие одежды, другие мысли, другая музыка, другая походка. И вдруг это весь мир Битлз вдруг открылся мне. И я увидел Вселенную, не то что Землю, а вообще увидел безумие. Я почувствовал Бога, понимаешь? Я почувствовал что-то такое святое в них.
olen tagantjärgi püüdnud mõelda, mis oli see, mis lummas. Kuna ei olegi nii lihtne nagu sõnul seletada. Tunnen, mis oli natukene loogika ja mõistuse väline ja samas hevis nagu mingit ühendavat, koondavat väge.
Вот этот комплект, благодаря которому мы стали чувствовать, что мы не такие, как вся основная масса проживающих в Советском Союзе, что мы чем-то отделяемся, что мы понимаем и чувствуем несколько другие вещи, чем тот комплект разрешенных чувств, который существовал в Советском Союзе. Что-то можно было чувствовать, а что-то было запрещено чувствовать.
Although hippies both in Soviet Union and in the West opposed the ruling order, the Soviet hippies were not inevitably driven by political protest. They didn't share a distinct oppositional stance. They didn't want actively, let alone strategically, convert the regime. Rather, they wanted to keep away from politics that they saw stagnating, rigid, and reeking of the Soviet state ideology. And also, the hippies saw politics, or they understood politics also in a very narrow sense of the term, equaling it with Komsomol, party politics, and the state ideology. And that was something that they really wanted to get as far away as possible. So when I would ask a Soviet hippie if they were political, if they were driven by political protests, they would say, not really. And as a researcher as well, instead of describing Soviet hippies through ideological lens, I would rather depict them as a community of shared affect. So what differentiated hippies from the rest of the society was their different emotional state. And I would describe it through emotional affective relation towards something that I have called imaginary elsewhere. So the notion of imaginary elsewhere theoretically draws from the idea of imagined community by Benedict Anderson. But it also draws on the idea by anthropologist Alexei Yurchak, imaginary West. That was the notion actively here present in the Soviet Union. And also the idea of ideascape, that ideas may travel transnationally, as proposed by anthropologist Arjuna Padurai. And also this notion has been developed, inspired by the insight from the affect theory. So imaginary elsewhere includes relation to unattainable West, the idea of Zagranitsa, this imagined West as present in the Soviet Union, and the sense of community with the globally protesting youth. But it also included spiritual practices and various experiences of altered state of mind, all of which played an essential part of the Soviet hippie milieu. So the hippies, in a way, they wanted to lift their bodies from this gray, oppressive, militaristic daily reality. They wanted to set their minds free, to trip in a psychedelic hippie heaven, to voyage to the dreamy landscape of the imaginary elsewhere. And all you needed to do to reach that state of mind was to dance wildly in a rock concert or hitchhike to the Soviet hippie so-called India, that was Central Asia. And the shortcut to that sense of imaginary elsewhere was through drugs. However, note that LSD, a defining drug of the American hippie movement, was not around in the Soviet Union. Thus, the desire to experience something more than the empty promise of the given by the Soviet power was not necessarily connected with the consumption of certain substances. Young people were inspired by the global hippie movement, and they enjoyed good music, and they believed more, they loved more, and their life was in the hands of this loose concept called kaif, which translates as high. And they were longing for freedom and joy in adventures, and their life was guided by, very often, spiritual practices. For sure, the movement included quite a colorful crowd of people, but if there was something that united them, it was the fact that they simply felt more. That's why I would address them as a community of shared affect. They shared this affective drive towards a sense of imaginary elsewhere. However, besides the emotional divergence from the mainstream Soviet society through their passion for rock music and Western pop culture, drugs, or spirituality, their striving for elsewhere was also realized in a very physical form, through travel. The trips to other cities were initiated by curiosity whether there would be like-minded people in other cities, whether there would be hippies in other places also besides one's hometown. The first connections with hippies from other cities were already made at the supposedly the first officially sanctioned rock music concert that took place in 1968 in a cinema house called Cosmos. So the event is known as Cosmos 68. And that's where some of the long-haired guys from neighboring cities also came here, and that's where the first connections were made. And that's how also Estonia became to be known as the Mecca for Soviet lovers of rock music. But I'm going to show you another clips from the documentary to get the better sense of where the traveling of the Soviet hippies took them.
Kuuekümnendatel mõeldi välja niisugune asi nagu autostopp. Pruukis ainult maik suhu saada ja juba sama suve lõpul käisid ma nii paar korda kuus, näiteks Piiteris või Moskvas. Kui ma isegi lõin need kilomeetrid kunagi kokku ja sai kuskil 2,5 ringi ümber ekvaatori. Pigem oligi ilma plahvatuseta arenev protsess. See meie teadmise kogemine. Et ma ei ole üksi, et meid on palju. Sai teada, et Tartus on, et Riias on, et Kaunases on, et Vilnuses on, Leningradis on, et Moskvas on, et Novosibirskis on, et Irkutskis on, et Sevastoopolis on, et Kiievis on, et Lvovis on ja nii edasi ja nii edasi. No seega saingi tasapisi kinnitust, et hipirahvast on pea kõigis tolleaegse NSV Liidu suuremates linnades.
У нас среди хиппи один из первых, который начал увлекаться культурой хиппи и делать People's Book, книга людей хипповых. Это как хиппи-библия. О, этого я знаю. О, это Киев, это Москва, это Таллин, Рига, Вильнюс, Каунас. Класс, знаешь.
But what happened very soon after the emergence of the first hippies in the Soviet Union in late 60s was that the authorities got a hold of them. They essentially, they politicized the bodies of these young people who wanted to grow their hair and wear outlandish clothing that was not typical of the Soviet youth of the time. And so that resulted in this various kind of diminishment of the hippies, surveillance, sometimes also forceful cutting of the hair. Some of the people who were considered the leaders were arrested or taken to psychiatric hospitals. So it very soon, this kind of active repression of the movement emerged in this narrow period between 1969 and 1971. And as a result of it, the movement was pushed deeper underground. And it shifted the weight of the movement from performative presence towards different kind of mobilities. So firstly, towards this imaginary elsewhere that I just explained before, the opportunities of inner refuge, so-called, or inwards journeys through spirituality, but also towards its hidden networks, towards being physically on the move and validating your identity as a hippie by being on the road and participating in the hippie networks. So hitchhiking, as you just saw in the clip, was really the main way of moving around for the hippies. And hitchhiking was also promoting by the Soviet state at some stage. And what it did was that it enabled youth to travel for free, but also it created an understanding by the drivers, so what this guy by the roadside waving his hand is actually doing. So very soon after, traveling became an essential element of hippie lifestyle. Travel forged the Soviet hippie identity. It created this feeling of us, as the person in the videos has said. And it also came with certain rituals, certain norms, folklore, and knowledge for survival on these long trips on the road. And these connections between like-minded people from different cities in the Soviet Union, it soon developed into subcultural network across the urban centers of the Soviet Union. And that was often referred by the Russian-speaking people in the movement as sistema, which translates from Russian as the system. So essentially what it meant was that you knew somebody who recommended you. And then when you hitchhike to an unknown city where you haven't been before, you have a couple of phone numbers, you call them, and immediately you have a place to stay, you have friends, you have meals, and all the fun that comes with people who are like-minded, who are also hippies. So they were exchanging these contacts, they were referring to each other, and that's how the network was growing. There were those who were sitting in one place and perhaps hosted new hippies from different cities every other day or every week. And then there were those who, as the spring came, from the 1st of May, that was officially known as the opening of the hitchhiking season, and it was celebrated in Tallinn, where I'm now at the moment. So, and then they hit the road and spent the next 4 or 5 months on the road, surfing the couches of different hippies of the Sistema network.
Siin oli mul töökoda ja siin sai siis niimoodi hippide poolt ööbitud. Siin armastasid paljud käia, muusikat sai kuulatud. Seksi saab, kõike saab. Ikka. Eks ta elu käis ikka alati ühtemoodi. Ükskord ainult, no see oli ainult ükskord, kui mul oli niimoodi, et ma ise majja ei pääsenud, et jalad olid uksest väljast ja nii palju inimesi tuli. Ja siis muidugi, no kuhu ööbida, no sassi juurde muidugi. Kaheksakümnendate algusest juba olid märkmikud ja igasugused need samused, kuhu, mis linnas, mis kohas võisid pöörduda, et leida omale fleti. mis oli muidugi KGB-le arusaamatu, et kuidas te suhtlete, te ei kirjuta üksteisele. Telefonikõnesid ka praktiliselt pole, no ei ole telefoni. Ja muidugi nad olid väga pahased, sest no kontrollida ei saa.
И был и протест, и эскапизм. Были люди, которые хотели в результате потом уехать куда-нибудь на Кавказ и жить там в пещере с такими религиозными какими-то делами. И некоторые так и поступали. Были люди, которые стремились куда-то уйти, были люди социальные, которые протест, они его как-то пытались оформить в виде искусства, либо в виде музыки, либо картины.
Selles mõttes oli ta kiiresti ise organiseeriv avatud süsteem, nii et see siis teemanimetus täitsa sobib mõnes mõttes.
Valged hommikud tulevad kaunis rongkäigus. Katavad maa virguva valge oma kasteste juustega. Kastest tõusevad väikse pärselged laulud.
So by late 1970s, the hippies in the Soviet Union were far from simply mimicking the Western hippies. The hippie movement had really turned into a distinctive subculture in its own right. They had their own slang languages, they had their places of encounter in different cities. The Sistema network was a very specific formation of the Soviet hippie movement. It was the essence of their subculture, which turned out as one of the most significant Soviet underground worlds. And that world was simultaneously forged by the external influences of Western hippie movement and Western pop cultures, but also the local socio-political context, because it was unthinkable to go on the street and protest in public, but it was possible to develop this movement inside of these cracks of the Soviet Union through these networked activities, and that movement or that these mobilities were essentially driven by the desire to see what it's like elsewhere. So the most massively, the hippies traveled between neighboring cities, from Tallinn to Riga to Kaunas, etc. More ambitious travelers took their journeys to Central Asia, Caucasia, or even Far East, where the purpose was perhaps not that much to meet fellow hippies, but to engage in that kind of spiritual journey, to get further into Sufism or shamanism or Buddhism. Moscow hippies often tell that there was this kind of that travel was part of this initiation of becoming a hippie, that on the first summer when you become a hippie you need to take a trip to St. Petersburg, then on the second summer you should go to see the Baltics, and then on the third summer when you're already much more experienced you should take a bigger journey to Caucasia or to Central Asia. And Central Asia was indeed this kind of coming-of-age journey for a real, true hippie, because that was the so-called Soviet hippie India. One could learn about the Sufism or pre-Islamic cultures and then really enjoy these miraculous mountains. And those who were kind of more more serious were then going to Buryatia, which is further east, and that is where one could encounter Buddhist cultures. And one quite interesting way of traveling was getting a job by carrying animals from Estonia to other Soviet regions, and these animals were cows or pigs, and then the people would need to spend a couple of weeks feeding these animals on the train, and then you would get paid 200 rubles, which was quite a nice sum of money in that time, and you were already there. And also in these traveling circuits, the hippies started having their own summer camps. The first attempt to that kind of summer gathering was in 1977 near St. Petersburg, but after 10 days of hanging by the beach, the Soviet police bashed them around, and then the people moved on to Estonia, and in Vietna they continued camping until the end of summer. And then the next year the summer camps were taking place near Riga, and they were continuously bringing together hundreds of hippies or alternative-minded people who were camping in the nature, and that tradition was going on until early 90s when with the establishment of national borders after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, but the hippie travel did not only forge the joy of being on the road, it also enabled them to distance from the Soviet daily reality. It enabled them to achieve this sense of freedom within this 1/6 of the planet that was the size of the Soviet Union. And despite its rigid and very highly protected borders. But just for the reference, there were a couple of hippies who managed to cross the borders of the Soviet Union in 1985. And that was around 20 days of very rough travel, of that 5 days without any food and so on. But who could have thought that just some years later the borders would be open and Estonia would regain independence, and people could travel and move abroad if they got a visa. So, and that leads us to the second part of the lecture, which is about my current project about young Estonians abroad. Indeed, there was a wave of emigration in early 90s, and that was concerning mostly Estonian Russian-speaking population here. But especially after Estonia joined European Union in 2004, we have seen rise in higher education and labor mobility. And that was also my own experience when I finished high school and started university. And when the first summer came, I was going to London just for fun, but also to get a work, and absolutely legally. And my current project is interested in exactly that kind of movement and emigration that has happened after Estonia joined the European Union. And the project is still ongoing, but so far we have conducted a survey with over 2,000 respondents, which is quite a good number for a small country like Estonia. So we questioned people in the age of between 20 and 35 who had finished their high school in Estonia and who had lived at least 1 year outside Estonia within the past 10 years. And so my interest is this latest wave of emigration and nomadic patterns among these young people. And just a little bit to give some profile of the respondents, then around 60% of them are currently living abroad outside Estonia, and 1/3 of them are in Estonia, and then there's less than 10% who are living in Estonia and some other country. Also, majority of them, 77% exactly, are currently working, not studying, but our interest was also to give some attention to the higher education mobility. So what were the reasons for going abroad? While living conditions in the receiving countries as well as salary were highly mentioned, or were some among the main reasons of going abroad, then there's this peak into a reason which is simply called a chance to see the world. And that was stated as one of the main reasons for going abroad. Over 60% of the respondents and over 90% of them considered this among one of the reasons of going abroad. And that leads to this idea of striving for elsewhere. The respondents considered their experience abroad in very high satisfaction terms, in both in terms of everyday life and spare time. That was the leading, and a little less in terms of social environment. But overall, people who had an experience living abroad or studying or working abroad considered it in very high terms. So just to jump back to the Soviet hippies, then the hippies tended to take jobs that would enable them to travel. Well, like the stereotypical job for a hippie guy was to work in a steam houses, because in the summertime the houses it's warm and the houses don't need any heating, so that job enabled them long summer vacations. But there were other ways to trick with the paperwork to get more sense of liberty, to have long summer breaks in order to travel. So what would be the equivalent of the second decade of the 21st century for that kind of adjustment of lifestyle? And probably you guessed that it would be related to remote work and digital nomadism, which has become one of the identity markers as well. So what came out in our research is that this chance to see the world as a reason for going abroad was even much more stated among those who identified as digital nomads. So this is the higher, the upper panel is indicating these people who belong to the group of digital nomad or state themselves as belonging to that group, and the lower one is the rest of the respondents, and we see the difference is there. When thinking about return migration, which is a matter of public interest for a small country like Estonia, then we can see that among those who listed their main reason for going abroad as a chance to see the world, many more people came back to Estonia. And this is the upper panel, which shows those who chose that reason as mainly, and we see that half of them are currently back in Estonia. And here's the factors that have facilitated the return to Estonia. The red line shows those who are currently still living abroad, and the blue line shows the responses of those who have returned back to Estonia. And what is very interesting is this gap between considering this first factor, which is a job offer with a good salary, then we can see that those who are currently abroad, around 70% of them consider this as an important reason that would potentially facilitate the return to Estonia, while very few people have actually came back to Estonia for that reason. However, those who returned back to the reason, their main reason for returning was desire to return to their homeland. And it is even slightly higher than among those who are currently living abroad. And another interesting aspect of that question is that very few people who returned back to Estonia listed as important factor the political or governmental changes in Estonia, while it is a significant reason that would motivate people who could potentially return back to Estonia who are currently abroad. But how did the COVID pandemic influence the return migration? And here we can see that the return migration happened for people who among our respondents were in the age between 20 to 24, as well as those who were studying, and that is quite logical. They were students studying abroad, and then as the pandemic hit and the universities started to work remotely, then these people returned back to Estonia. But it is also interesting that those who self-identified as digital nomads and who considered that as an important part of their identity, they also, many of them, returned back to Estonia, which highlights then this desire to see the world, perhaps, or that is the motivation to travel and to live abroad, not that much other reasons that would perhaps create more stable migration. And then how these young people see their future. As majority of our respondents are currently living abroad, then also a large part of them envision their future living and working abroad. But it's also interesting that this second major trend about the future plans is to take up work that would be location independent. And that again refers to this idea of remote work or digital nomadism as something that would facilitate more mobile lifestyle. So just as Soviet hippies developed their networks that enabled them to travel and see like-minded people in other cities, they generated this Sistema network, the system network, and actually that network by the 80s, it grew into a much bigger phenomenon than the Soviet hippie movement. And so equally we could see that the contemporary young adults, for them it could be the remote work or digital nomadism that would enable them to strive for elsewhere, to peek beyond the mountains and beyond the horizon. So we might think, what would be the post-COVID world like in terms of travel and migration patterns among young adults? Considering the environmental footprint of air travel and the likelihood of acknowledging it by the new generation, in some ways the future of travel may resemble that of the Soviet hippies. Traveling more locally, traveling by trains or ride shares, visiting friends, and slow travels, and perhaps also exploring further the potential of the vertical travel or inner refuge, when you don't need to move your body at all or just a very little. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm happy to receive your questions and thoughts.